Good afternoon, Dr. Innocenti. How are you doing today?
Excellent. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am a professor at KU. I've been here since 2000. It was my first job after I graduated, and I love it here.
Yeah. And how did you come to study argumentation?
I first was a teaching assistant for Lloyd Bitzer in a class called Argumentation and Debate, and that was my first exposure to argumentation. When I was at the University of Wisconsin, I also met Fred Kaufeld and Gene Goodwin. I don't recall any conversations at that time about argument. I transferred to the University of Illinois and took a couple of classes with Joe Wenzel in argumentation, and Tom Conley, who's also written on argumentation.
I didn't know you were at the University of Wisconsin for a little bit.
Yeah, 92 to 94. My advisor was Lloyd Bitzer. He retired. Ed Black retired. I found myself without a committee. So I was advised that I may want to transfer. And so I did. I went to University of Illinois.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Memories.
Yeah, and who'd you end up studying with at Illinois?
Tom Conley was my advisor. My dissertation was in the history of rhetoric. Lord Kames' Elements of Criticism. He was an 18th century advocate and judge, and actually argumentation folded very neatly, or the history of rhetoric folded very neatly into argumentation.
Very cool. And what do you believe the study of argumentation offers society?
A way of managing disagreement.
Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Mm-hmm. The question is, how can we manage disagreement? There are all kinds of things we can do. We can liquidate the opposition, for example.
That is extreme. Have you been watching Judge Dredd?
No, I haven't. And I haven't been watching the Republican National Convention either. Liquidating the opposition, that is a way to manage conflict and disagreement. Ignore the opposition. Another way to manage it is to exchange reasons. So I think that is a really important activity.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that when we inevitably are going to come into conflict and disagreement, we only have so many ways of managing it. We could destroy the other side, ignore the other side, or we can turn to reason as a way of dealing with it. And so what argumentation offers us is the ability to turn to reason.
That's right, in a nutshell, yes.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. So what would you call your approach to argumentation?
Well, I would actually call it rhetorical because it involves looking at messages in a context. But more specifically, I call it normative pragmatic because I aim to provide accounts of how a message is designed to work. And broadly, the account is that they are effective, pragmatic, because they are ethical, normative.
Can you give me an example of what that means exactly?
Okay, gosh, how to do this in an abbreviated way. So one story someone could tell about why a message works could be psychological because it adjusts our cognitions, our attitudes, our beliefs in particular ways. A normative pragmatic account explains the potential efficacy of a message in terms of its normative structure. So just by virtue of saying something, we bring to bear some responsibilities and commitments. A simple declarative statement, for example, engages a presumption of veracity. The listener can presume that I wouldn't say something is true. I wouldn't try to get you to believe it unless I had made some responsible efforts to try to determine the veracity of it.
And so veracity means the truth of the claim.
That's right.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that when we talk in ordinary language every day, there is an underlying assumption that we're telling each other the truth.
Well, right. In context, of course, there are all kinds of cases where we might just be playing around or whatever. But in cases where we are seriously saying and meaning something, yes, those communication acts bring to bear responsibilities, obligations, even very basic ones.
Yeah. Okay. And so what would you mean by the ethical force of these different acts then?
The presumption of veracity, for example, that's engaged just by making a declarative statement, changes the world, changes the context just by saying it. In that it gives you that presumption gives you a reason to believe what I am saying. And that reason is that, oh, she wouldn't say that unless she had made some responsible effort to try to determine whether it was true.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So it seems like some of your approach is drawing from what people would generally call speech act theory,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which the students may or may not be aware of, but speech act theory says that language is performative. It doesn't just mean something, but it also has a functional aspect in that it does something, right?
Right. The classic formulation is that we do things with words.
Yeah. Can you unpack what that means a little bit?
Making a promise, for example, is something that we do only with words. I cannot not imagine how you can make a promise without uttering, I promise that. And that makes a difference in the world. If I promise to show up to this meeting at 1:00, then I've undertaken an obligation, a responsibility to actually follow through on that
Right.
promise. And you can act in accord with that commitment, responsibility that you've seen me undertake. And I have to say it, otherwise, you can't hold me to it.
Right, exactly. So you've undertaken a certain commitment and an obligation, which in turn changes how other people behave and act.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So can you kind of walk us back then and talk about how this might be related to a study of argumentation then?
Mm-hmm. One, I'm not going to open the can of worms that says arguing is a speech act. I think it's a complex speech act. But when I say that I approach argumentation from a rhetorical perspective and look at the full message, excuse me, that means that I'm looking not just at people making claims and giving reasons, but at all of the things they are doing in addition to that and what the added value of that is.
Yeah. So one of the things that you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, is that when people argue, ordinary people argue, they have to say it or write it or some way to communicate that message. And so you're interested in studying all of the communication. And as such, that communication does things in the world.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So for instance, there's a lot of different ways that one can communicate, and those actions might do things in the world, and that you're interested in different strategic ways that those can be designed to, increase or decrease the likelihood that someone might accept or not an argument.
Or another way of putting it would be to, in addition to likelihood, would be to generate persuasive force or some pressure to do something, and obligation to do something or stop doing something.
Yeah,
Okay.
that makes a lot of sense. So what exactly then is an argument? if you're talking about, it's not just the act of communicating, how would you describe an argument?
I always go back to Dan O'Keefe's essay on paradigmatic cases of arguments. So there's the argument one in the sense of a claim and a reason, and they're linguistically explicable. You can say what they are. Um, there's also the sense of arguing in the sense of overt extended disagreement. But people may be having an argument in that sense, but never make arguments one, give claims and reasons. They could just be name calling, but still be having an argument.
Yeah.
But what I focus on in my research is argument one making. So the making of arguments in the paradigmatic sense of claims plus reasons. Again, in addition to that, those other message design features.
Yeah. So how would you identify when one of these has occurred?
Mm-hmm. I look for the stylistic marker of claim plus reason. In other words, I'm not trying to rewrite or reconstruct something into the form of premises and conclusions. I'm looking for the stylistic token claim supported by reason, like the Declaration of Independence or a legal brief that's organized around claims and reasons. Those are paradigmatic cases of argument making.
Yeah, so you're looking for things that are intuitively, you look at and you see it and they just appear like arguments. You're not looking to do some sort of effort where you have to change the text a significant amount to turn it into an argument.
That's right. If someone asked me to find a metaphor, yeah, okay, I'd look for a comparison not involving like or as. Someone asked me to find an argument in this text. All right, I'm going to look for claims and reasons. Now I understand that you could bring in those frames. You could talk about anything in terms of metaphor.
Yeah.
You could rewrite all kinds of messages as in the form of an argument, but I'm looking for arguments presented as arguments.
Yeah.
In a paradigmatic sense.
So can you walk us a little bit through then your method of analyzing a piece of text as argument?
Mm-hmm. My two main questions are usually what strategies is the person using to try to do something specific, and why do they work?
Yeah.
And so I look at those strategies. My go-to is typically to first look at a text in terms of speech acts. Is this a proposal? Are they exhorting? Are they demanding? And so on. And then look at not just those utterances that fit squarely in those categories. I demand that you X, but also all of the other message design features that are brought in with that message in order to give that, say, demand persuasive force.
Interesting. So what you're saying is one of the things that you hear is that a speech act or in an argumentative approach has two features, a functional and an expressive. So one of the things that you look at is the functional, and that is what could be categorized as one of the speech acts. And then you also then look at some of the design features in the expressive side as well and how they come together.
Yeah, you could absolutely put it that way. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. So how do you assess quality then?
Mm-hmm.
The argument.
Right. Well, step one is to ask, does the person discharge the responsibilities, obligations, commitments, and so on that they have undertaken? Yeah. And then I also consider whether it's appropriate. Now that's vague.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the $100,000 question too. How do you make an assessment of what's appropriate? And for that, my go-to is Kenneth Burke still. Kenneth Burke wrote an essay called Psychology of Form, where he talked about form as the creation and fulfillment of an appetite in the auditor. But he provides some vocabulary for looking at, again, a full range of message design features and a way of thinking about them in context, syllogistic form, qualitative, repetitive, conventional. He's got a catch-all category called other forms.
I love the catch-all.
Yep.
That's interesting. One of the things I really like about this framework is whereas a lot of other argumentative schemes have a predefined category that they impose upon the argument, you really allow to account for the context, what could be determined by the dyad. Let's say it's two people arguing, and allow them to intersubjectively, that is, between the two of them, define what counts as a good argument through their discharging of obligations and ideas, or obligations and responsibilities.
Right. It's argument evaluation has got to take place in a context, and that context, you can look at the context as created, at least in part, by what people are saying. So
Yeah,
if I make a promise, I've changed the context because now I've created a world where you can hold me accountable for doing what I've promised to do.
yeah. And if we could pause on that for just a second, because the students might have heard the word context before, and that gets used in a lot of different ways, right? I think the idea of context as an imposed set of constraints from the institutional level, like, let's say, a legal context, a medical context, is different than the way we're using context here, which is something that is totally determined by our conversation, more something akin to like a discourse space, right? That is unique to you and I.
That's right. That's not to deny that other elements of context aren't relevant, but they're a lot of times kind of given and beyond our control. We didn't set up the rules for how this court of law works, for example, but we may be, to use the pragmadialectical term, trying to strategically maneuver among those rules, regulations that exist. But yes, that's exactly right. That in addition, what we say changes the world. It changes the context.
Which is so cool to think about, right? We often think about language as a narrow instrument or the hypodermic needle, but when you recognize that your speech act actually has this sort of power to compel, when you can undertake obligations and that you can put them on others, I think that's really kind of cool. I was wondering if you might have an example that we can walk through one of your ideas with the students to demonstrate how you might think of a normative pragmatic model.
Okay. Okay. An example of normative pragmatic.
How you might think about how they exert force onto an auditor.
Right. Yeah, coming up with a simple, straightforward example. Well, here, we could talk about a guarantee.
Okay.
Someone guarantees that this product will do what they say it's going to do. So they've undertaken an obligation or a commitment for the product to do that and backed it up. And so just that guarantee has created a reason for you to buy it. It's changed the world, again, by putting that obligation or responsibility out there.
Yeah.
And here's another example. Donald Trump fails to live up to basic standards of truth.
Yeah.
I think that's a given. I think the most recent article I saw said that he's lied 20,000 times.
Wow.
Since he's been in office. It's August 27th.
Way to make my stuff evergreen, Dr. Innocenti. Thank you.
Well, it's so says. Why? Because he is not meeting the basic responsibility or obligation to have made efforts to determine the truth of what he's saying.
Yeah.
So his remarks, again, are easy to dismiss, or in other words, they lack persuasive force. Now, people believe him. People believe him when he says things like there's going to be massive ballot fraud, or there's been massive voter fraud, or there were millions of people at his inauguration more than ever before. People may yes, they believe that, but over the long term, it's so easy to just dismiss those claims as worthless.
Those people are going to believe him regardless, right? You're not persuading anybody, right? There are certain people that are going to just agree with him. When you're looking at the capacity to persuade, right? He has no credibility. He has no ethos, is what you're saying.
Well, yes, definitely. And his speech, his communication lacks persuasive force. It is just easy to dismiss.
Yeah.
Because he's not meeting, he has a history of not meeting the very foundation of the persuasive force of really any speech act. And that is having undertaken some responsibility to try to say true things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, right? So if you haven't done it in the past, it seems one of the things you're highlighting that's interesting is how this can have an aggregate effect too.
That's right. So a normative pragmatic perspective can take the long view. So in the short term, maybe a message is effective in the sense that it persuades, it changes attitudes or beliefs. But you hope that there is a broader network system, structures designed to hold people accountable for meeting or not the obligations that they undertake.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So I was wondering if you had any closing remarks to future argumentation scholars.
I don't. I would encourage people, though, to keep in mind that argumentation is a special kind of activity, and so not everything is an argument. You can talk about it that way, but the exchanging of reasons is a very special, unique kind of activity that's worth examining in its own right.
Yeah, a lot of people like to call everything an argument, and everything is not an argument.
Right. I mean, you could call it that. You could call everything a narrative. You could call everything a metaphor. And yeah, I mean, you can look at it that way, and that can generate interesting insights. But that the communication activity of argument, again, because we want to, I think, try to create a just world, is a good way of managing disagreement. And so a good activity to foster and develop.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, I really appreciate your time today.
I appreciate the chance to talk and yeah, spread the word a little bit.
Have a lovely day.
Thank you. You too.
Cheers.
Cheers.